Okay, so I'm Luke Turnock from the University of Winchester. Not doctor yet. I will be sitting my viva 2 weeks from today, so hopefully fairly soon. My presentation is on the rise of image-enhancing drug use amongst young people. I'm specifically focusing on young men here. Other research has been done looking at young women's use of these drugs, but that wasn't really covered in my research, which was mostly ethnographic and qualitative in nature. And I'm going to be applying economic concepts to why young men are using these drugs in order to help explain why social media is having such an impact on this rise in use, which I'll get into. So just a quick background on these drugs. Primarily I'm talking about steroids and human growth hormone, but there's also fat burners and other things. So typically these were all used for performance purposes historically amongst sportsmen. There was use of some dietary drugs from the early 20th century onwards, but this was solely for keeping slim as opposed to this emergent trend of having a ripped, muscular, vascular physique. So that really first started coming about in the 1980s within bodybuilding subcultures, inspired by Arnold Schwarzenegger and other stars that people saw in the media. But at this time it was very specific to the subculture. So if you wanted these drugs, you would train in a bodybuilding gym. Whereas what we're seeing now in the past possibly 10 years, maybe slightly less, is a lot of young men who don't train specifically for bodybuilding, they're beginning to use these drugs now for social media and as part of this hedonic lifestyle where they're trying to attract attention in nightclubs. So that's really what I'm focusing on explaining. And as I said, I'm going to use a couple of economic concepts to try and delve into this issue. So the first thing is this idea of status symbols as part of identity formation, which Shane Blackman covered in relation to drug imagery. And this idea that if we adopt a sort of Chicago paradigm of a normative society and deviant subcultures, we can see we have status symbols in both. So in normative society we have the idea of business suits, expensive cars, etc. as signals of status, and in subcultures I've used the example of fighters where we have tattoos in cauliflower ear symbols identifying young men with these subcultures. So the idea is that through use of these drugs, image-enhancing drugs, particularly steroids, young men can signal in both of these realms. So there's not only the subcultural identity formation aspect to it, there's also a broader signal to kind of normative society to do with embodying the masculine ideal as it's portrayed in all forms of media. So I'm just going to first address this idea of the physique, the body, as a form of conspicuous consumption, which employed young men to try and attain status. So conspicuous consumption is a theory that Torstein Veblen came up with in the late 19th century. It's this idea that people will buy expensive goods or go on trips where they're very lavishly demonstrating their ability to afford these things. So it's implying wealth, implying connections, and it's a means of achieving status. And Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he's applied this theory to visible tattoos, another form of body modification, and said that they signal one's ability to succeed outside of the regular economy. People with tattoos on their face, on their neck, hands, might find it difficult to get employment in the regular economy. So if you have those, they can be kind of used as a status signal to say, I don't need to worry about getting a job in the regular economy. And I've got the example of the UFC fighter Cody Garbrandt commenting how he got the neck tattoo and said, this is it, I've got to be a fighter now because I'm not getting a job elsewhere. So it's clearly understood by the people who are participating in this behavior. And that's really what I found in relation to image-enhancing drugs within my own research. So I'm using some quotes from my research throughout. Excuse me. So first there's this idea of the body just as a status symbol. I got this quote, it's image in it. Who can be the biggest one in the club? Who can get the most girls' attention? So he's making it very clear it is all about status. Who's getting the most attention? Who's the biggest? It's all about a sort of portrayal of dominance, masculine dominance, I suppose we could say. And there's also this element, because obtaining these physiques, which are very lean and muscular, would require a large investment of time, of money, and being able to stick to a strict diet. It's signaling status in the form of conspicuous consumption as well. It's signaling I have the capacity to focus on my body to this extent. And of course, what we're seeing is that the use of these enhancing drugs is essentially a shortcut to being able to show off that status. So a lot of young men who are seeing an increase in the size and muscularity of others around them are turning to these drugs as a means of attaining the status that they're witnessing other young men achieving. So just to demonstrate that this isn't, the drive to get these physiques isn't purely based on the biological attractiveness of these physiques, it's interesting to note that a lot of the young men who are pursuing this goal are engaged in activities which would be harmful to the goal of having a physique if that was its only purpose. So again, I've hit on this as indicative of conspicuous consumption because these are young men who are binge drinking, they're binge eating very greasy, fatty foods, and it's all part of an hedonic lifestyle. And I've got this quote about my mates and I go out, have a good time, eat kebabs, have beers, yet they're still ripped, and everyone wants it. To know how they can be ripped, how they can be lean, still have a good time. So again, it's demonstrating that not only do I have the capacity to invest this much in my body, but I'm so far ahead of everyone else, I can engage in these harmful behaviors, and that's a further status signal. So it shows it goes beyond just the biological attractiveness, and it really is a signal from a consumptive perspective. And as I've noted at the bottom of this slide, the body seems to be just one part in a lifestyle oriented around this kind of conspicuous consumption. So young men are wearing expensive clothes, driving expensive cars, going on trips to, in England, Ibiza and Magaluf. I suppose here it's trips to Bali, that sort of thing. And also this note I've made, if you ever go to a gym and watch the young personal trainers, guys in their early 20s, they nearly all drive BMWs. I don't know if that's the same here, but in England that's definitely the case. So again, that ties in with this idea of status, and the body is a very core component within these subcultures. So Hirsch came up with this idea of the positional good, that some goods are only valuable based on their scarcity. And I've got a few examples here. Limited edition iPhone color. It's identical to the regular edition iPhone, exactly the same internally, it's just the color that's different, but if you pay the extra money to have the limited edition color, you're signaling, well, I can afford to pay more. So that's probably the best example of a positional good I can come up with. And we can see that a physique which is relatively more impressive acts as a positional good in this regard. So again, if you were to look at individuals such as Charles Atlas, who in the 1940s had the Charles Atlas program, which a lot of young men subscribed to, and you compare his physique to men today, he doesn't look at all impressive because the average has increased so much in the intervening time. But because he was impressive for his time, his body acted as a positional good. So what we can see is that as more and more young men are working out and are using these drugs, it actually creates a sort of tragedy of the commons whereby they're ever more needed, they need ever more use of these drugs and ever more training in order just to keep up with their peers. And that's where the impact of social media is going to come into it. So I've just got a few quotes just to evidence this effect. Again, we see, as with the earlier slide, it's all about who can be the biggest alpha male. So it's all about comparing oneself to one's peer group and trying to be above them, so to speak. We've got another who notes that when your friends are around you and they're using these drugs, they're engaging in these behaviors, it's very hard to not be blinded by what you're witnessing and get involved in the same behaviors. And then my thesis focuses on normalization from a sort of subcultural perspective, so that's covered in a bit more detail there. Got this other quote about for acceptance, for attention, and maybe a bit of peer pressure. You see somebody and say, I want to be as big as him, and then it's, well, you'll have to take this in that case. And finally, I've got a quote from a personal trainer saying that he's trained a lot of young men, 16 to 24 age bracket, and he says they'll all look up to a bloke in the gym and they want to do whatever he's doing to get those arms. So it is all based on competition, it's based around how one perceives themselves relative to their peers. And this is why social media is so significant. Because what social media is doing is it means young men are able to compare themselves to men from all across the world, and because of this method whereby we create echo chambers. We friend people who have similar interests to ourselves, we follow people with similar interests. So what we're finding is a lot of young men, not only are their horizons broadened in terms of the people who they can come into contact with from opposite sides of the globe, but they're also narrowed in the sense that now they're specifically following men who are interested in living the same lifestyle, having these same physiques. So this really seems to be accelerating the issue with regards to male insecurity and feeling a need to get these bodies, and thus using these drugs and engaging in other harmful behaviours. So again, we've got to note that posting one's physique is purely for likes, and it's for standing out on social media. So again, coming back to this theme of it's all about status, and social media has served to exacerbate this effect even further. So again, with young men increasingly subjected to these images, there is a kind of unrealistic portrayal of how young men believe they should look. So Dr. Harrison Pope wrote about this with regards to images in movies and television, and he wrote this book in the year 2000, The Adonis Complex, regarding that. And what we seem to be witnessing is social media is the next step beyond that, which is creating even more pressure. And as these respondents were quite astute in their observations, that actually you see the benefits of this drug use on social media, but you won't be seeing the negative side effects because no one wants to put themselves down. So you're seeing a very false portrayal of the benefits of these drugs without seeing, they could damage your heart, they can give you acne, all sorts of things. And luckily a few of the respondents seem to be aware of this fact, but that wasn't necessarily the general trend. And I've just got a couple of references to other researchers in this area. So we have Bleecker and of course Moroney and Van der Ven, who wrote about the rise of the steroid selfie and said it really does seem to be a phenomenon that young men are specifically using just to have that really ripped profile picture for their Facebook, for their Instagram, etc. So the final economic concept I wanted to apply is this idea of time preference, and hypothesizing that social media is increasing time preference, by which I mean reducing the ability to delay gratification. So these young men have instant delivery of updates from either friends or other people who are in shared groups or from Instagram models, etc. And they're being bombarded with these images of this is how the normal male body looks, and I don't look anything like that. So it's creating a real urgency and incentive for young men to try and mimic this, and of course they're turning to these drugs. And I think the second quote I've used here really emphasizes this: I need to build mass, I need to. And again, I've got some other quotes kind of relating to this concept of I'm going to die sooner or later, I might as well do what I can now to enjoy myself and to have that status that I'm seeking. And of course the top observation that it's part of a trend, this new age fitness culture that's really sprung up with the rise of social media in the past 10 years. And everyone wants the quick path, and things are trending a lot more. So a lot of young men are having increased time preferences. And I saw that, I detail it in my thesis with regards to young men who are using these drugs in spite of significant health impacts. And they're saying they're not worried about what's going to happen in 20, 30 years' time because they need to look a certain way now. And I've related it to, Haggerty spoke about one of the few subcultures which were associated with this type of drug use prior to the normalization with social media, was homosexual communities in the United States in the late 1980s. And he noticed that there was a fear of AIDS, there was a spectre of death in the air, and it was at this time that we really see the first use of these drugs outside of performance or competition related subcultures. So I think it's just interesting to consider that essentially social media seems to be having a similar pressure to the fear of death on young men's time preference. It's all about increased urgency and not worrying about 20 years' time, which I think is quite significant. So I just have a few preliminary recommendations. Obviously social media seems to be having a very significant impact. Seems to be the primary influencing factor. So making clear to young men that social media is giving a false image of how they quote unquote should look is probably one of the core things to address. So the first suggestion is personal trainers in gyms are seen as authority figures Not all of them are using drugs. The ones who aren't might be in a good place to be advising young men, and if we can utilize them as harm reduction outreach workers, that's probably a good strategy. And the next one, I note this video that was put on YouTube by Mike Thurston, who has hundreds of thousands of followers, explaining to his followers, don't believe everything you see on Instagram. He's an Instagram model, and pointing out that a lot of what they see is false, it's Photoshop, it's specifically professionally lit images and so on. And I think if we can help encourage the dissemination of such messages, then that will also help to counteract some of the negative effects that we're seeing. And of course, I've just recommended we'll need some more research specifically looking into this type of harm minimization. And that is my presentation. There's my references. Thank you. That's why I felt personal trainers and people such as fitness models, they're the ones who really need to give this message. Because if I try and speak to these young men as an academic, it's probably not going to be successful. If these young men are going in a gym and they're having a personal trainer who they look up to, it's a figure they respect, and he's saying to them, or indeed she's saying to them, don't be using these drugs. What you're seeing on social media, it's not a realistic representation of the effects of what you can expect. I think having those authority figures delivering that message might be more successful than prior academic attempts. So that was really my thinking there. But of course, as I said, perhaps more research and sort of encouraging the specific study of this area, because this was just one element of my broader research on the normalization of drugs. And as I said, Mulrooney and Van der Ven are doing some quite good research in that area, so hopefully they'll have some further suggestions. No, it's the United Kingdom, so it's a sample of 27 total respondents. So I did 18 interviews going in depth, and then I was also conducting ethnography, so I had a few more people who just spoke to me in the gym, and I took field notes. So this is preliminary sample. All the quotes come from those 27, but I'm tying it in with broader research, such as Bleeker's, such as Mulrooney and Van der Ven's.
That's in Australia, so this is...
No, that's the United Kingdom.
United Kingdom, sorry, okay.
So I sort of broke it down in my thesis of this idea of almost two simultaneous subcultures involved in it, one which could broadly be termed sort of workout culture, and the other a new interpretation of what in the 90s was called lad culture, that is now ever more focused on the body, and this idea that sort of the working class respondents were more in the latter of those, and the middle class were more in the former, but they both very much share an overlap with the influence of social media and with the status of the body, but it's more the workout culture, more broadly, so to speak, is middle class people going in the gym and sort of showing off the weights they're lifting and videoing themselves lifting big weights, whereas the more working class conception is they're going out to the nightclub and showing off their body when they're there. So I observed it in both class contexts, but certainly you could tease apart the differences between the slightly different subcultures in that regard. But both, ultimately, it was about the status that the body gives one. Yeah, well, the interesting thing, so specifically within the Instagram photographs as a means of showing off status, that is primarily targeted at other young men. But of course, another part of the status in these kind of masculine subcultures is the idea that you can attract women, and having photographs of yourself with attractive women is also a sign of status to other men and women. So it's kind of having the body to be able to attract women, to show off that you can attract women. So there's, primarily I would say, yes, it is targeted at other young men, but there's also an element of wanting to attract female attention in there. Yeah, I did have one respondent who was talking about fitness modeling and as well selling supplements, going in gyms and using one's body to sell supplements, and sort of the ethics of that, because he's using illicit performance enhancers, but he's representing that these legal enhancers that he's selling will give you the body he has. So there was a bit of interplay regarding that, but it would be interesting to sort of do a bit more research on that specifically, perhaps as a separate piece, because I didn't have enough respondents who were involved in that sort of thing to be able to look at it in any real depth.
Luke, thank you very much for sharing that
Thank
with
you.
us.